This is an amazing story. The baddest knight simply goes back in time and starts kicking the asses of all the kingdoms that betrayed his lands with the power of his mighty sword. The story starts by talking about the useless eldest son of Count Perdium, and this guy was losing to him. The guy came up asking if he was comfortable because he spent a lot of money on that trap. Then, as the flames burn, our badass walked through the ashes asking if he liked it. The man, still gasping, asked if that trash Ghislaine knew about his plans. He walked around saying not only that, he also knew how many of them there were, how many were spies, and even who the reinforcements were, because in the end, he knew everything from the start. He still complained, saying it wasn't possible. How could a piece of trash dare to do this? But at that moment, Ghislaine just stepped on his face and threw him into the fire because he could try to invade as many times as he wanted. Hit win the next time and the next two, because he knew all the plans. 1 year earlier, the kingdom of Lithuania, near the state of Perdium, seemed to be preparing for a possible war. A man gasped as he woke up, trying to understand what was happening. He wondered if he was really alive, because he was almost certain that seconds ago he had lost a battle. The sound of clashing metal could be heard. A sword flew far away. Two knights seemed to be fighting, and one of them had lost. He had clearly been struck and was losing his life. It seemed that this was the end for the king of one of the 7 strongest continents, and Mercenary, Ghislaine Perdium. Thus, the man considered one of the noble knights Idun declared the end of the war. He asked if the man at his feet had any last words to say, and the other replied that he was only sad for not having fulfilled his revenge. Ghislaine kept his arrogance until the very end. Idun looked at him with disdain. It had been a surprise to discover that this man was the eldest son of the Perdium family, since it seemed he had abandoned everyone after his sister's death. The blonde questioned how he knew that information, considering the knight was raised in another kingdom, and he replied that he had spent years of his life trying to find Ghislaine, because it was his kingdom that worked alongside the Delphine family to destroy the Perdium family. Ghislaine was shocked to hear that information. He hadn't known there were others helping the Delphine family. Well, there wasn't much left to explain. It was time to face his fate. He grew furious, saying he would never forgive Idun for that. The other, with a certain madness and satisfaction in his eyes, delivered his final blow, ending the life of Ghislaine Perdium, and with him the entire lineage of his family. The young man looked at himself in the mirror, certain that it had really happened, yet here he was alive and intact. He wondered whether it had all just been a dream or an illusion, but it also seemed like he had gotten younger. Had he been kidnapped for some kind of experiment or something like that? Suddenly, someone called out to him. One of the family's soldiers named Ricardo told him to get out of the cabin now that he was awake. But Ricardo was caught by surprise when the young man held a sword to his neck. He said he would spare Ricardo's life if the soldier answered some of his questions. Staring at him threateningly, Ghislaine awaited a response. His soldier was clearly confused by the young man's behavior. Thinking it was all just a joke, Ricardo asked the young master to let go. Ghislaine questioned why the other was reacting that way. Ricardo pushed him away, scolding that because of the tantrum he threw earlier, he had fallen asleep. He asked if after his beauty nap he had forgotten everything. Just before, he was all fired up, saying he wanted to lead an attack group against the orcs. That information confused Ghislaine even more. What do you mean he'd thrown a tantrum? That made no sense at all. But Ricardo told him to get a grip because people were waiting. He asked where they were going since he didn't know anything about it, and the soldier replied that they were heading to the state of Perdium. Wait, what? They were going there? He asked Ricardo to repeat what he just said. After all, in the reality he came from, that state had already fallen. However, when he approached one of the mountains to confirm what was happening, he saw the state in the prime of its glory. But in his memories, he had already seen that place reduced to ashes, so how could everything be fine? Whispering, Ricardo asked if he had had a nightmare, because if he said that to other people, he would definitely be disinherited. Ghislaine pinched his own cheek to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and from the pain he felt, he was definitely awake. Little by little, he began to piece it all together. He had become young again. His country was just as it originally was, so there was only one answer. Somehow, he had gone back in time. When he was younger, he was the representative of the family. But due to his immaturity, people gradually distanced themselves from him. And because of that, he couldn't handle the criticism and ran away from home. Several years later, Ghislaine became a mercenary and won many battles, making a name for himself across the continent. When he finally felt ready to return and face everyone head-on, he found his homeland utterly defeated. That's when he realized he had lost everything. But now, a new opportunity had appeared before him, and the people he cared about were still alive. Realizing this, he could barely contain his happiness. But it was still too early to celebrate. Ricardo had said they were on a mission to stop the others. Ghislaine could never forget that day, because in his past, most of his battalion had died in that battle. When he was younger, they had told him there were only 3 ogres, so he saw it as the perfect chance to make a name for himself. But when he arrived at the location, he found out there were more than 20 ogres waiting for them, and most of the warriors died due to his stubbornness and inexperience. Well, he'd figure something out. After all, ogres normally had no defined strategy. The problem was whether any of his soldiers would be capable of trusting him, since they saw him as an incapable, spoiled brat. Suddenly, one of the watchtowers flew overhead and crashed in the distance. It looked like the ogres had arrived. Wild and brutal, they charged toward the soldiers. Ghislaine wondered if the ogres had arrived this early last time too. His battalion began to be decimated. Some soldiers shouted for them to form ranks. That was Commander Scoven. One of the others approached and attacked him. Scoven had let his guard down. There were more ogres than had been reported. Someone called out, warning him that there was an enemy behind him. That person rushed toward the commander and pulled him out of the ogre's attack line. Scoven was confused for a moment. Just like the enemy, Ghislaine prepared to strike. His sword sliced through the ogre's hand, splitting it in two and forcing the giant to drop his weapon. Everyone was shocked to see that. The ogre retreated in pain and collapsed in the middle of the battlefield. It seemed Ghislaine still couldn't use mana. If only he had gone back in time a little earlier. He turned to Commander Scoven and extended his hand, asking for something. At first, the commander didn't understand what he was asking for. Then the young man said he wanted Scoven to pass command of the troops to him. Ghislaine then waits for Scoven's answer. The older man thought the young one had to be joking. There were too many lives at risk. Because of that, he replied that he couldn't do it. Even if Ghislaine was the son of the king, he wouldn't simply hand over the authority he had earned through so much effort. Even though Ghislaine knew that he would probably act the same way if someone made such a request of him, he still couldn't help but feel dissatisfied with the answer. Meanwhile, another ogre was charging toward the two of them. The commander ordered Ghislaine to retreat since he was still inexperienced with this kind of leadership. Well, if the older man wanted to act that way, Ghislaine had no other choice. He threw his sword toward the giant, the blade passing dangerously close to the commander's head. Scoven yelled at him for that, but he stopped when he heard a strange noise, and as he turned, he was faced with an unexpected sight. The giant had been hit directly and collapsed backward right afterward. The commander couldn't believe the young master had struck the ogre's weak point dead on. Seizing the moment, Ghislaine questioned Scoven's decisions. His soldiers trembled in fear as more ogres approached, roaring. With a trembling army like that, there was no way they could win the battle. They needed to regain their men's confidence. Without saying another word, Ghislaine dashed for the troops, picking up his sword along the way. His speed made it look like he had wings instead of legs. Just like a hero, he dove in, attacking one of the ogres that was face to face with his troops. Everyone watched in disbelief. Was that really the young master they knew? Then the young man shouted, calling all the ogres toward himself. He declared he would take them down one by one. As expected, the enemies began moving toward him, and little by little, each one of them fell at his feet. Scoven wondered if he was dreaming or if this was truly happening. Even for someone like him, a mana user, doing something like that was extremely difficult. Seeing a skinny young man capable of wiping out ogres like that was nearly impossible. It was clear that Ghislaine was getting tired. It was obvious he was using the minimum energy possible to dodge the attacks while taking advantage of the openings to strike at their weak points, like a master of battle without mana, or maybe something even better. To provoke the enemy, he asked if that was the best they could do, and if it was, they certainly weren't living up to their reputation as a warrior race. All the ogres were chasing Ghislaine now, leaving the troops confused. They turned to the commander, waiting for guidance. But Scoven was frozen, wondering what on earth the young master was thinking. He had run straight into the group of ogres to grab their attention, and now he was running away. Worse yet, the direction he was heading toward was the edge of a cliff. But wait a second, if there was a cliff, no way that lunatic wasn't actually going to do that, was he? Suddenly, Scoven started moving. He ordered the troops to raise a shield wall. They would follow Ghislaine's idea. The ogres kept charging at full speed after the young man. Ghislaine was putting his trust in Scoven. The commander surely understood his plan, because unfortunately the limited stamina of his not-so-trained body wouldn't let him cut down all the enemies at once. But for now, he could still hold on. The ogres continued their assault, but seemed to forget that their enemy wasn't just one person. They were caught off guard. From behind them, the troops advanced, forming a combination of spears and shields, exactly as the young master had hoped. Then Ghislaine jumped off the cliff with full confidence in what he was doing. Now all the troops had to do was attack. Scoven gave the order to his men. The soldiers started pushing all the ogres downward, each push fueled by growing excitement, until they threw them into the air. Hanging onto the cliffside with his sword stuck in the rock, Ghislaine watched the giants fall. They had managed to win the battle. In desperation, Scoven screamed the young master's name, and as if he were a hero, we saw him clinging to the stone. Ghislaine gave a triumphant smile. The commander stared in shock at first, but then smiled. He extended his hand toward the young man, telling him to grab it. But the boy's hand slipped, and he ended up falling. What an unexpected plot twist. A gentle voice echoed in the distance, calling Ghislaine's name. It was the voice of his sister, Elena, and several fragments of memory about her flooded the protagonist's mind. He stared at one of the fragments, still dazed by it all. Suddenly, someone grabbed his arm. He saw his sister crying in front of him, asking him to come with her. Then Ghislaine woke up in a bed. It seemed to be some kind of inn. Apparently, the soldiers had somehow managed to save him. But what a strange dream that had been. Yet as soon as he sat up, muscle pain and the bruises from the fall hit him hard. That was definitely the consequence of using an untrained body in a fight like that. But at least now he was sure he was alive. Suddenly, a maid entered his room. She was clearly happy to see him awake. Ghislaine stared at her, still unable to believe that Belinda was right there in front of him, alive and well. The young woman started talking nonstop about how worried she had been about him. But before she could continue her chatter, he stood up and hugged her. She asked if everything was okay, if something had happened. But he just said he was glad to see her again. Belinda had been his personal maid since he was a little boy, the only one who always stayed by his side. But when his family was attacked, she disappeared, and they were never able to find each other again. Kislane never thought he'd be able to see her once more. He felt the urge to tell her the whole truth. So he told her to get ready because soon a catastrophe would happen in Perdium. And then he finished by saying that, in fact, he had died and come back to life. Belinda nodded, agreeing that the ogres had indeed nearly taken his life. He tried to explain what he really meant, but the young woman interrupted, saying that actually the one in danger was him, not Perdium. Without waiting another second, she started scolding the protagonist. What would they do if he had seriously hurt himself like that, especially with the festival season approaching? Kislane had clearly forgotten that in this timeline they were close to the festival period. She commented that Lady Elena was eager for them to go together. It was a great opportunity for the two of them to grow closer again, and he agreed with what the girl was saying. In his past life, he hadn't been able to enjoy the festival because of the trauma he had suffered. So he took the opportunity to ask how long until the festival, and Belinda replied that it was about a week away. Kislane fell into deep thought. A girl entered the room while he was reflecting on the day that had marked his memory and haunted him to this day. Elena holding him while crying, begging him to go with her. Exactly 1 week after that request, his little sister had passed away. Just like he had done with Belinda, he hugged his sister without a second thought. The maid watched the young master's reaction in shock. His sister asked what was going on with him, if it was some kind of joke, but then he whispered that he missed her. She pushed him away, calling him weird. For a child, she actually had quite a bit of strength. The young girl said it was Belinda who had called her there and that making up wasn't that easy. She repeated all the stupid things he had said in the past, and he couldn't believe he had actually said all that. In his past life, he really had been a scumbag and not very close to Elena, so he decided to apologize to his sister. The two were startled by the young man's new behavior. It really did seem like the ogres had hit him hard in the head. He threw a little tantrum saying he had taken down the brute squad, but then suddenly felt a huge and bothersome pain. Of course, he had managed to defeat all those ogres. After all, he came back in that state of pain and still unconscious, his sister teased. Then the two girls burst into laughter at the situation, and he watched them, as if taking the chance to preserve that moment in his memory. It was comforting to know that everyone was still just as he remembered. He regretted having wasted so much time on useless things in the past. At the last festival, he had turned down Elena's invitation. Because of that decision, that ended up being the last time he ever saw her. Shortly afterwards, she was found in pieces along with her guards. His greatest regret was not having been there for her. Someone knocked on the door asking to come in. It was Elena's knights, Jamal and Philip. She asked if something had happened for them to barge in like that, and Jamal said she was being summoned to oversee the festival's organization. Kislane asked why they would assign that to Elena. Belinda scolded him, saying it was obvious he didn't know anything. He did nothing all day after all. The knights and Elena said their goodbyes to the two, but then he asked if he could help as well. His sister was surprised by his request, and the two girls took the chance to mock him again. Surely he had been hit hard on the head. Meanwhile, in the main courtyard, preparations for the festival were in full swing. It seemed that an argument between two people was clearly making the other workers uncomfortable. Elena and her brother were arguing since he wanted to help but was actually getting in the way. He thought that last time his sister had been found behind the festival area, so someone had either forced her there or lured her. And to prevent that from happening again, he needed to map out all the castle's entrances and exits leading to that area. While they were arguing, a knight approached, calling out to Kislane. He remembered that face. It was good old Fergus. It seemed that as soon as he had heard about what happened during the ogre battle, he rushed as fast as he could to the young master. Helena couldn't have been happier to see Fergus's team and asked the old man to take her brother back to his room. Well, there was no way out of it. He'd have to leave the mapping for later in the week. Kislane seized the moment and asked the knight to take him to the castle's abandoned training grounds. He said he wanted to go there to start his training. The old man instantly understood the young man's resolve and took him to the abandoned field. When they arrived, Kislane was surprised. The place was in much better condition than he had expected. That field was perfect for his training. He'd never seen anything like it in his mercenary days. Fergus said they had always kept everything maintained ready for the day the young master would want to start training. He had faith in Kislane, swearing that all his tantrums and stubbornness were just a phase. So that meant that in his previous life he had done the same thing. The protagonist felt a little guilty seeing all the care and hope that had been placed in him wasted back then. He joked that the old man better have a long life ahead of him. Kicking the bucket was no good. Fergus asked how the young man even knew that expression, and Kislane replied that he had already experienced death. He had just been born again, and like the other two, the old man didn't believe him. The young man said he was going to start training, and the soldier stepped back. In the past, he had treated those around him like enemies, but he was just a blind fool. Well, now he had to act quickly. After all, he only had 1 week. In the past, he had claimed the one responsible for his sister's death was a lord from the neighboring territory. But because of that accusation, Perdium went to war and ended up in ruin. Therefore, in theory, the attack on his sister was the catalyst that started everything, which meant he had to prevent things from happening like they did before. The first step was to improve his physical condition and stamina. It was awful having so little time, but at least by then he could control his mana. Mana was essential for humans like him to surpass their limits. Everyone said that sensing and controlling that power was the hardest part, but during the chaotic battlefield, he had managed to do it. First, he had to connect with the mana particles floating in the air, gathering them little by little. For someone like him who had experienced over 10,000 battles, forming a mana core was easy, but if that core were enough, he definitely wouldn't have been one of the 7 strongest knights on the continent. Using a method from a burned book from his past and the natural human mana core, he was able to create a second and even a third core, and linking the 3 cores could generate explosive power. His body suffered a small collapse. It seemed he had hit his limit, even though in his past life he had reached 5 cores. Although that method could give him explosive strength for a few minutes, the mana cost was enormous, and it was because of that he had lost to Idun in his past life, since the enemy had brought an entire battalion to fight him that week. That technique was still a bit unstable, but this time he had time and he was still young. He was determined to take Idun's head, and of those cowards who allied with the Delphine family to destroy his kingdom, he would absolutely destroy all of them in return. A week had passed and now was the night of the festival. Kislein prepared himself for a silent battle. He walked around the castle grounds and found his sister. She was surprised to actually see him there. He usually never came to events like this. It looked like her brother had really changed. Rumors were going around the castle that he had spent the whole week training. Well, it wasn't a problem. He was, after all, next in line from a warrior family. His sister teased him, saying that he used to never care about these things and only ever complain about their father. Whatever. She liked this new version of him. It seemed like her old brother was finally back. The protagonist felt a little unsure about it, because over the past week he had observed many things he hadn't paid attention to before. To his change in attitude, he was able to see things gradually shifting. Overall, the flow of events might still be the same, but it was hard to measure the impact of his actions on the small details. Making good use of the knowledge he had about the future was his job. He had to respond to each situation effectively, and have the necessary preparations in place. As he scanned the surroundings, he walked through the festival with his sister, dragging him from one spot to another. And so the sun set and night fell. His sister was happy, though she complained a bit that the festival was always the same every year. Meanwhile, he remained on alert. The celebrations were almost over and nothing had happened to his sister yet. One of the knights asked Helena if she wanted to check out other areas in the festival. According to his friend, there were some new events happening elsewhere. She happily accepted the invitation and went off with the knight. It seemed that Kislein had found the first culprit. Those two were the traitors to the family. Helena's personal knights and bodyguards, Jamal and Philip, are considered the most trustworthy men in the kingdom, having protected the princess since she was a child. It was said that they died trying to protect the princess, but it seemed the truth wasn't quite like that. Now there was a strong chance that they were actually the traitors to the family. They arrived at the location Jamal's friend had mentioned, but the place was completely empty, not a single soul in sight. Helena asked if this was really the right place. It didn't look like there would be any kind of performance in a place like that, but the knight insisted. They kept talking while Kislein quietly observed the area, exactly as he had suspected. At first glance, it seemed like just an empty alley, but the way the obstacles were positioned made it clear. All the escape routes were blocked. They must have prepared that setup in advance. But in the middle of his reasoning, he was pulled by his sister. The knight kept insisting about the show, but the young girl didn't want to stay there any longer. Her brother asked if she worked out or something. Her strength was oddly abnormal. Suddenly, Philip blocked her from leaving. Strangely, he asked them to wait just a little longer. In that instant, Helena noticed something was wrong and started to feel scared. She asked why the two were acting so strangely. Jamal apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare her, but a very special request had been made to him. She was confused. What he was saying didn't make any sense. Then, someone else appeared in the distance. It seemed the real interested party had arrived. The man praised the knights for their work. It had really gone according to plan. Jamal quickly stepped toward him, saying he had brought her just as requested. Now the man needed to deliver on what they had agreed. But the man, whose name was Frank, noticed there was one more guest. Standing beside his sister was none other than the eldest son of the Perdium family. Jamal said his presence was just a bonus. The kid had followed them without even realizing he was walking into his own grave. Kislein turned to the knight and asked if he had really sold them out. Corrupted by greed, the knight confirmed it. He said all he had to do now was flee to a kingdom far away from here. They were tired of this barren land overrun by barbarians, and surely others had already left Perdium before. It wouldn't be hard. Before he could finish talking, Kislein attacked him without mercy. A traitor was a traitor after all. The others were startled by how sudden and precise his attack was. At least the ones who had left earlier weren't traitors. Kislein turned, glaring furiously at Philip. In desperation, the soldier grabbed Helena, holding her tightly, but he was quickly knocked out as well. Everyone was stunned by how impossible the turnaround seemed. But now Kislein had his sister safe by his side again. It seemed the information about the eldest son of the Perdium family had been wrong. This wasn't some clueless, spoiled kid with no battle skills. Even though they were caught by surprise, the boy had taken down two knights in the blink of an eye. And these weren't simple attacks. Both knights had infused mana into their swords. Alina asked what was going on. Kislane paused for a moment, thinking about what to do, but not wanting to traumatize his sister any further, he decided to put her to sleep for now. He gently laid her down on the ground right after. The enemies thanked him for saving them part of the job. He really was nothing like the rumors had claimed. Frank asked if he had been hiding his true abilities all this time. He grabbed Philip's sword, saying the information he wanted was pointless now after what he had seen. Kislane looked at the three opponents in front of him. The two in the back he could handle, but the one in the middle had mana levels currently above his own. He needed to finish this fight as quickly as possible. Taking advantage of the moment, he asked whose request this was anyway, but the other refused to answer. Kislane hadn't expected him to give it up so easily anyway. You could make him say it, word for word, soon enough. One of the thugs asked if they should attack lethally, but Frank responded no, he wanted the brat alive. Frank wanted to make him agonize until he turned into his own personal work of art. The two men charged at Kislane, but the prince was already prepared for it. He threw a candle toward one of the enemies. As the man instinctively focused his attention on the object, the young fighter struck at his blind spot with precise accuracy. The other thug scoffed, saying a dirty trick like that wouldn't work on him. Kislane parried his attack. In less than a second, he saw an opening, grabbed the man's sword, disarmed him, and immediately went in for the finishing strike. In the middle of his movement, he sensed a presence. Frank attacked him from behind, but Kislane managed to defend at the last second. It was the perfect opening. How had the boy managed to defend himself? Frank wondered. Without hesitation, Kislane corrected his stance and counterattacked, landing a hit right on the enemy's neck. Frank's pipe fell to the ground. But that wasn't enough. The man's sword came down toward Kislane. It forced him to block using both swords. It seemed the enemy was capable of using mana in ways beyond simple attack. If not for that, Kislane would have already finished him. Kislane was shocked by that ability. The man began channeling even more mana into his sword. He didn't know how this kid had learned to use mana at such a young age, but one thing was certain. The boy's life was going to end here. Kislane smiled at seeing his enemy's confidence, and Frank was surprised to see him smiling. The young man dodged the older man's attack and used the opening to land a powerful kick. The two stepped back and Frank sighed, saying that amount of mana wasn't enough to hurt him. But the effects of the kick showed a moment later. He collapsed to the ground. There was no way that amount of mana, the little he had shown earlier, could have pierced his defense. What the hell had that brat done? Kislane stepped forward, saying he hadn't expected to come face to face with the real culprit behind the attack on his sister's life. Knowing that the man right in front of him was responsible made his rage boil and pushed his power to the absolute limit of what he had trained during the week. Frank had better be ready to deal with the explosive power of the third core. The enemy stood frozen in shock at the sight of that power. But before he could even process what he was seeing, Kislane lunged at him. He was fast, and his continuous strikes were hard to follow. The prince executed a double strike, and even though Frank blocked, his grip was starting to weaken from so much defending. His sword began to crack. Frank had never heard of such explosive power before. It was like Kislane had become an entirely different person. The young man launched his final attack, the sword shattered, and Frank was now completely vulnerable. Without a second's hesitation, Kislane charged and drove his blade through him, making the enemy scream in pain. He pinned him against the wall. Before Frank could pass out completely, Kislane still had questions, and so he asked who was behind the attack on his sister. But Frank refused to surrender. From his sleeve, he pulled his small dagger. At the very least, he would finish the job before losing his strength. He prepared his strike, but was suddenly restrained by mana ropes. Kislane wanted to make him a deal. If the enemy didn't try anything else and answered his questions, he would let him go. With every passing moment, Frank grew more terrified of the prince standing before him. Those mana ropes, they were real. Kislane slightly twisted his sword to get the man's attention back on the negotiation. His offer was good. After all, he could easily destroy Frank's mana core if he wanted. It was time for the older man to make a decision. To prove he wasn't bluffing, Kislane channeled mana into his sword and cracked Frank's mana core. Frank started screaming in terror. Any wrong move and they could blow the entire area to pieces. But Kislane calmly replied that only amateurs let that happen. He knew exactly how to break someone's mana without causing an explosion. It was at that moment that Frank realized the boy wasn't bluffing. If this kept going, he was going to die. Fearing for his life, he shouted that it had been Count Desmond. He explained that the Count wanted a pretext to start a war and wipe out the Perdium family. So it was really Desmond who orchestrated the attack on his sister. In his previous life, the Duke allowed allied families to do the dirty work. Duke Delphine was quite the strategist. Kislane asked Frank if that was why he wanted Alina dead, and he confirmed it. Without another word, Kislane knocked him out for good. Frank protested. That wasn't part of the deal. But what did it matter now? He had certainly taken plenty of lives and was now scared of losing his own. Even so, he continued to struggle, throwing his rage at the young man, yelling that nothing would change. No one would listen to a spoiled brat like him. Out of patience, Kislane grabbed Frank's face. There was one thing Frank didn't know. Kislane had been reborn. He had come back from the future, and this time, things were going to be different. And so Frank's mana core continued to crack. Right as the first firework exploded in the sky, his life faded away. All the traitors and enemies lay on the ground. Ghislaine turned back and saw his sister still sleeping peacefully. His sword slipped from his hand and he let out a sigh of relief. Another change had been made. But right after, the rebound effect from the power he had used hit him and he dropped to his knees in pain. Sometimes he missed his old body. Activating 3 cores had been nothing back then. But he couldn't let that break him now. He still had one more thing to do. Seeing the warehouse door, he charged at it and broke inside. In his previous life, the son of Count the Great had also been found together with Alina, and soon after that, war broke out. He wasn't going to let that happen again. He pulled a candle from his pocket and set the place on fire. No evidence could be left behind. Then he carried Alina over his shoulders and got out of there as quickly as possible. What Ghislaine didn't know was that during the entire battle, someone had been watching him, a spy who disappeared into the night right after. The mission to eliminate Elena had failed. Upon hearing that information, everyone in the council went into an uproar. After all, she was just a little girl. They had bribed her guards and even sent the mercenary Frank. They had let their guard down thinking it was an easy mission. But the one responsible for the failure had a name, Ghislaine. Everyone grew more and more furious. The prince was supposed to be nothing more than a spoiled, stubborn brat. Because of that, they even started doubting the spy's report. But the spy stood firm, saying the boy was completely different from the information they'd been given. He had drive, he knew how to fight, he used mana, and hadn't been hit even once during the fight. It was as if he were an entirely different person. Besides that, the mission concerning the Degard family had been completed, so there was no issue in starting a war over territory. He just needed one more chance. Without any mercy, they began verbally attacking him. They had poured rivers of money into that mission, only for it to fail. Because of that, the spy's life was now too dangerous. He had to be eliminated. Amidst the shadows, a voice emerged, silencing the entire room. A man sat on his throne, bathed in moonlight reflecting through a red-stained glass window. He asked what kind of chance the spy wanted, and the spy replied, he wanted to get rid of Ghislaine. He planned to orchestrate a duel between the prince and someone capable of taking him down. Everyone became interested in the person the spy had in mind. He said the name was Cain Loges, a warrior famous for his strength and a master swordsman. Despite being young, no one in the Northern Kingdom could defeat him. Besides that, Cain was Ghislaine's cousin. It wouldn't be difficult to manipulate a duel between them and make it look natural. Everyone fell silent and thought it was a good idea. But if he failed again, there would be no third chance. Meanwhile, in the castle's training grounds, Fergus was looking for the young master. A line of mana shot toward him, grabbed the sword at his side, and flew into Ghislaine's hand. Good. The training is paying off, Ghislaine said before noticing the old soldier's presence. The warrior apologized for the intrusion, but admitted he was curious how the prince had done that. Ghislaine showed Fergus the mana line attached to his sword and explained it was one of the techniques he could create with mana. In his previous life, he used it with ease, but with the limited mana of his current body, it was harder to maintain. Still, even with low mana, if he used it correctly, he could pull off some of his old moves. Fergus said he had trained with mana for years, but this was the first time he had seen anything like that. But doubt started creeping in. Before, the prince couldn't even use mana, and now he was pulling off things beyond normal. They continued talking, and the soldier explained that he had come just to thank Ghislaine for saving Elena's life. Ghislaine replied that he had done no more than his duty. There was no need to thank him. A few days passed, and the festival had been suspended after the attempted kidnapping of the princess. Elena was furious because everyone thought she was lying when she said her brother had saved her. She told him he should speak up, but Ghislaine replied that there was no reason to do so. Belinda was furious too after discovering the betrayal of Philip and Jamal. But the most important thing was that Elena was alive. That alone had prevented the war from starting for now. Ghislaine knew he wouldn't be able to stop the Nolan forever. He needed to strengthen his military forces. A maid arrived with lunch and served them while he was deep in thought about how he needed to start understanding politics soon. But when he uncovered the food, he discovered it was just a piece of dry bread. He asked Belinda if they were eating dessert first, but she replied that things were complicated right now. Suddenly, shouting came from the window. Merchants were demanding compensation for the damages caused by the festival's cancellation. Everyone was furious. Most of their income came from that festival, so they had started a protest. Ghislaine looked at the commotion from the window. Belinda was clearly worried. She knew this could happen since the festival was the main source of income for those merchants. But since it was cancelled after just one day, it was only natural that they were furious. This was definitely not good. Things would only get worse if he didn't do something quickly. Ghislaine asked Fergus to send soldiers to calm the crowd, but the knight replied that they didn't have enough troops. Most of them had been sent to rebuild the forest outposts after the ogre attack. The kingdom of Perdium was always at war, on one side against northern barbarians and on the other against the monster-infested forest. No money in those soldiers. What a mess. He pulled Belinda aside to talk. She was responsible for managing his finances, and he wanted to use his own money to calm the merchants. But she replied that the prince had no money left. Because of his habit of spending like money grew on trees, the court had cut off his allowance, which meant he was bankrupt. Taking advantage of the moment, he asked Belinda to lend him some money, but she didn't have any either. No money in those soldiers. What could he possibly do? He asked himself while looking out over his kingdom from the window. Even knowing what would happen in the future, if he didn't have funds, there wasn't much he could do. Someone rushed toward him while he was lost in thought about what to do. Ricardo appeared, gasping at his door. Ghislaine asked why he was in such a hurry. They had a problem. Master Cain had appeared and wanted to speak with him. Hearing that name, the prince's world stopped spinning for a moment. Scoven wasn't having one of his best days. He was hit again, this time square in the face and then in the chest. His armor caved in under the punch, and as he collapsed to the ground, Ghislaine arrived. His commander lay erect at his feet, and the prince's blood boiled at the sight of him in that state. A deep, cheerful voice echoed, pleased with Ghislaine's arrival. Standing in front of him was a man built like a double-door stainless steel refrigerator, twice his size. There was only one person he knew with a body like that, his cousin, Cain Loges. The prince looked at his cousin with disdain. He knew that face all too well, and it was never pleasant to see. Cain was one of the heads of the Loges family, with whom the Perdium family had an established alliance. When they were younger, Cain had been his only friend, but now he was his greatest enemy. Cain approached the prince. Still unsure about the situation, Ghislaine asked Ricardo what was going on. Ricardo explained that they had received a report about a fight at a tavern and discovered the culprits were Cain and his guard. When the soldiers recognized them, they asked about the rumors concerning Ghislaine, and Scoven explained everything in detail. But as soon as he finished talking, Cain grabbed him by the chin and demanded to know how he dared lie to the Loges family. And that's what had led to this situation now. His cousin claimed that the commander deserved the punches he got. If he was capable of lying like that, he could deal with the consequences. Cain said he only did it to see if he could knock some sense into him. Nothing would have happened if the soldier hadn't lied in the first place. Ghislaine stared at him. It did make sense that his cousin would act like that. Cain had always been a brute who treated him like a subordinate. Every time he visited Perdium, he caused chaos, and no one ever said anything because Cain ranked higher. No one ever doubted Cain's abilities. Unlike Ghislaine, who grew up with an inferiority complex, Cain's confidence was seen as a virtue. It was mainly because of him that Ghislaine had been so harshly criticized in his past life. Cain watched Ghislaine and noticed something was different. By now, the kid should have been all worked up from the provocations. A little earlier in the kingdom of Loges, someone had approached Cain with a request to eliminate the prince. If he succeeded, the Loges family would gain the support of the council. Cain figured it was an easy task. Dealing with his cousin was nothing, but since Ghislaine was one of the core members of the Perdium family, he couldn't just eliminate him without a reason. Then a spy explained the plan. They would stage a duel between Ghislaine and Cain, and during the fight, an accident would happen. In the end, it would look natural, not like it had been orchestrated. The spy wouldn't be present to pull the strings. Cain would have to manage the situation himself, but still it was a golden opportunity even for him. Thinking about having to kill his own cousin, Cain accepted the mission without hesitation. But now seeing how different Ghislaine seemed, he started to wonder, maybe there was another reason those men wanted his cousin dead so badly. In that case, he decided to wait a little longer and observe. The prince looked at his cousin, confused, as Cain casually sat down on the ground. Cain said that since he was here, he wanted Ghislaine to bring the gift he had prepared. He heard the festival had been cancelled, so he wanted to lighten the mood. After all, they were always good at that. The young man thought for a moment, trying to remember what Cain was talking about, and then it hit him. That guy always expected Ghislaine to arrange drinks and women for his parties. In the past, Ghislaine had always given it in out of fear of being beaten, and because of him, he'd wasted all his precious money. Belinda's words echoed in his mind. Suddenly, he looked at his cousin differently. His future source of money was sitting right in front of him. Out of nowhere, the brute shouted his name and said that if he remembered what it was, he'd better bring it fast because he was getting impatient. Ghislaine responded that he would absolutely bring the women and drinks. No problem. But first, Cain needed to pay the debt he owed him. No one expected that twist. Ghislaine explained that he had always paid for everything with his own money, and the total debt now stood at 1,000 gold coins, plus a little extra. Cain scoffed at the amount, saying Ghislaine had done all that because they were friends. It didn't make sense to charge a friend for that. Friends? Ghislaine snapped. You treated me like a beaten dog since the beginning. You better pay up now before I make you run from here, and frankly, I could really use a nice sum of money right now. The tension in the air rose sharply. Ricardo couldn't believe what his young master had just said. Cain stood up. It looked like his little puppy needed a lesson. He was getting full of himself. But in the end, he was just a useless parasite. That's why everyone in the north calls you a disgrace, Cain growled. A prince, the head of the Perdium family, and all you do is spout garbage like this. He wound up for a solid punch, but at the last second, Ghislaine dodged. That little movement surprised everyone there. Cain continued his assault, but Ghislaine kept dodging. Then, seeing an opening, Ghislaine landed a clean hit to Cain's chest. The brute was caught off guard, but before he could react, the blonde aimed for his chin. Or at least tried. Cain blocked the strike. Ghislaine stared at him calmly, trying to figure out what his cousin was trying to do. A few seconds later, Cain fell to the ground coughing. His servant rushed over, asking if he was okay. Ghislaine turned to him and told him to stop pretending. He knew that last hit had been blocked. But the servant immediately started attacking Ghislaine verbally, shouting at him to back off. Suddenly, murmurs spread through the crowd. It seemed like Ghislaine, the spoiled prince, had just beaten down the prodigy of the Loges family. The young prince immediately realized what was happening. This was the setup. Meanwhile, Cain and the spy whispered about their next steps and how they could spin the situation to blame the prince. They had the perfect opportunity to turn this into a spectacle. Cain pulled a glove from his pocket, preparing to formally challenge Ghislaine to a duel, twisting the situation in his favor. But before he could finish, a glove came flying right into Cain's face. Ghislaine had challenged him first. Cain was left speechless. The blonde continued, declaring that for insulting the Prince of Perdium in front of everyone, and for knocking out his commander, disgracing both his dignity and nobility, they would duel. And Cain had better not dare refuse. It was clear now. The enemy's plan hadn't gone exactly as expected, but they had achieved the ultimate goal, a duel. With that, Cain Loges accepted the duel and said Ghislaine Perdium had better not regret his choice. The fire burned bright in the prince's eyes. He called Ricardo and told him, "Bring me all the merchants protesting outside the castle. Tell them I'm about to give them a very generous reward." The festival had been suddenly cancelled, and the lively, cheerful atmosphere of the people quickly faded. It left behind a few tourists who didn't want to return, regretting not having spent their money while they could. They were clearly eager to spend what they hadn't been able to before. In a situation like that, if any kind of event were to happen, the crowd would explode in excitement. Bets were being placed all around the audience on who would win the duel. Because of that, the marketplace surrounding the arena was booming. One of the merchant leaders had set up a betting table, and it was the busiest one there. Cain stabbed his sword into the ground and asked how Ghislaine had managed to turn a sacred duel into a circus like that. He declared that his sword wouldn't stop, even if Ghislaine surrendered. So that was the goal of those two. Well, since a good number of people had shown up, it was time to begin. Someone shouted for them to wait. It seemed Cain's soldier was trying to intervene, claiming that the betting wasn't appropriate. But actually, despite being in Perdium, no one had bet on Duke Ghislaine. To be honest, the result seemed obvious. The spoiled brat stood no chance against the brute. Cain took the opportunity to mock Ghislaine. Even his own people didn't believe in him. One of the knights stepped up and suggested changing the betting terms to how long the young duke would last against the other warrior. He dropped a bag of money onto the table. It was Scoven and Ricardo betting on the prince. In response, Ghislaine smiled. Another bag hit the table. Now Belinda and Elena had shown up to place their bets. That surprised everyone. No one expected the two of them to bet. It seemed the scales have finally balanced. The spy glanced at them from the corner of his eye. Cain grumbled about having been kept waiting for no reason. It was time for the duel to finally begin. Ghislaine commented that it would be strange for him to make the first move since Cain was the older one. He drew the sword from his belt and readied it, showing that he was prepared. Then he called Cain to the fight. In response, his opponent glared and said it was far too late for him to try acting like the elder now. The signal for the duel was given, and the brute charged straight at his cousin, who blocked the first attack. Cain pressed his sword harder and harder downward, saying Ghislaine had come too far just to try saving face now. The blades clashed, slid apart, and Cain came back for another attack, this time with the hilt of his sword, followed by a kick that shattered part of the arena floor. Despite all his brute strength, Ghislaine dodged every strike. The crowd went wild as the two faced off after that intense exchange. Meanwhile, those who had bet on the young duke were fearing for his life from the sidelines. But it was already too late. By common reasoning, anyone who chose to fight Cain had walked into a trap. Because of his overwhelming strength, opponents always preferred dodging rather than confronting or counterattacking. But from dodging so much, they eventually got tired. And that timing window of exhaustion was when they met their end. Cain Loges had always won that way. He acknowledged Ghislaine's growth. His cousin was indeed faster. The brute spun his sword in his hand and attacked with the hilt. Even though the prince blocked it, that wasn't the point of the move. Cain turned, yanked his sword with all of his strength, and flung Ghislaine away. The entire crowd went silent. The spy was already celebrating victory. Ghislaine flew over the arena, past the spectators, but he still had a way out of this. The prince concentrated mana into one of his legs, and as soon as he landed on a rooftop, he used the momentum to launch himself straight back toward Cain. His sword struck the brute in the side. Neither Cain nor the spy could believe what they were seeing. They had definitely underestimated his power. Taking advantage of the moment, Ghislaine said that with such a flawed technique, Cain's enemies only ever lost to him out of fear of his brute strength. It was time for his cousin to open his eyes to reality. The older fighter felt insulted by those words. He charged, demanding to know how a spoiled brat like Ghislaine could possibly defeat him. But with a swift step, Ghislaine stopped his attack, dodged Cain's sword, and struck him from a blind spot. Even so, Cain refused to stop and moved in for a closer, more direct clash. But the prince stomped on his sword, pinning it to the ground, and then hit him square in the neck. Silence consumed the entire area. Cain had clearly lost. It had all happened so fast that the crowd couldn't even follow it properly. And as soon as they snapped out of their shock, they erupted into deafening cheers. Duke Ghislaine had evolved. For the first time, he had brought pride to the citizens of his country. His allies couldn't have been more satisfied with the result. But the enemy's plan wasn't going as well as they'd hoped. It seemed the strikes had been purposely superficial, indicating just how much control Ghislaine had over his sword. How did that spoiled brat improve this much in such a short time? Cain wondered. They stared at each other for a second. and without any warning, Ghislaine threw his sword out of the ring. The monstrous gap in skill between the two meant there was no entertainment left in using swords. So Ghislaine decided that from this point on, he would fight barehanded. Cain was furious, but his cousin continued, saying he wanted to take this opportunity to teach a lesson, this time with his bare fists. "What do you mean by teach me a lesson?" Cain asked. Well, it seemed he wasn't a match for Ghislaine in a fair sword fight, so the prince wanted to try fighting hand-to-hand. And in return, Ghislaine himself would bet double the original wager that he would win. The crowd started getting confused by this sudden twist. Because of the change in the duel, the spy couldn't be more grateful for the prince's insane decision. The betting table's manager announced the new round. It was now Cain versus Ghislaine in a fistfight. People started placing bets, and obviously, most bet on Cain due to his brute strength. But after what they had seen, some bet on their lord Ghislaine. His cousin couldn't be more confident, especially now that they were fighting without weapons. Cain threw off his cloak. He would make sure to put it to good use. Belinda booed Cain, yelling at her master to pick his sword back up. It felt like a boss enemy was charging his ultimate attack. But Ghislaine was faster. As soon as Cain brought his sword down, Ghislaine dodged. The brute then used the sword like a staff to try and land a kick on the prince, but Ghislaine struck his leg mid-move, interrupting the attack, then followed it up with a punch straight to his chin. Forced to retreat, Cain couldn't believe it. How could that spoiled brat now be landing hits like that? The announcer hyped the crowd even more. "Get up," Ghislaine said. "I'm still warming up." Consumed by rage, the brute started throwing punch after punch, but none of them landed. Just a few months ago, Ghislaine couldn't even look him in the eyes. He used to kneel the moment Cain showed up in town, but now not only could he defend himself, he could fight back, each strike growing heavier. Through the pain, Cain realized he needed to end this quickly for the sake of the Logis family's future. But the hits kept coming. It was like Ghislaine could see every opening in his movements, landing precise blows at every weak point. Even with all his strength and fighting experience, why was he getting beaten like this? Ghislaine grabbed him by the hair. "I feel sorry for your father," he said. Count Logis had helped the Perdium family when they needed it most, simply because they were friends. But his son clearly didn't share the same ideals. A few years ago, a young Cain had complained about the help his father, Flores, was giving Perdium. Their own country wasn't in great shape. It made no sense to invest in a land as broken as theirs. Cain had watched as his father prepared to leave. He begged him to stay. Everyone tried to convince the Count not to go. "Why are you doing this?" the boy had asked, and his father answered, "Because we are friends." With his father's words still echoing in his head, Cain snapped back to reality, just in time to see another punch coming. This time he closed his eyes, but the impact never came. Instead, he heard Ghislaine's voice. "I think I've taught you enough." He opened his eyes to see his cousin standing over him, hand extended, offering to help him up. Cain stared at the gesture, then bowed his head. He had to admit defeat. The crowd went dead silent for a moment, then exploded into cheers at the official announcement of Prince Ghislaine's victory. Some cried over the money they lost. Others celebrated like there was no tomorrow. The spy stormed into the arena, shouting, "How can you admit defeat? This small setback is nothing. I trusted you." But Cain ignored him, stood up, and told him to leave him alone. Everything had gone wrong. The entire plan had collapsed. Ghislaine walked toward the spy, getting his attention. "It's time to do what we agreed," he said. The man looked at him, confused, not understanding what he meant. That's when the prince turned to the crowd and shouted, "Food and drinks are on the house. For everyone." It was definitely going to be a huge loss. But nobody says no to free stuff. The entire crowd burst into cheers. In desperation, the spy yelled, "I didn't agree to this. Take that back." Ghislaine placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "That's the least you could do. You lost the bet." And as agreed, not only would none of it come out of the betting pot, but they also had to throw in an extra 2,000 gold on top of the original wager. "You better not run," Ghislaine added, "because you already know what'll happen if you do." In the end, both the spy and Cain accepted their defeat, and the kingdom of Perdium couldn't have been happier. The next day, in Ghislaine's room, he locked all the doors and windows and opened the treasure chest full of money he earned. He was stunned by the amount now sitting in his room. Even this little fortune was enough to hire a small mercenary group. Ghislaine closed the chest, deep in thought about how to spend the money, when he noticed two presences inside his room. Belinda and Elena had come in without knocking. "What are you two doing here?" he asked. Elena didn't waste time. "What are you planning to do with all that money?" she asked directly. "Do you want some?" the prince replied, half joking, but the girl shook her head. Belinda, on the other hand, said she knew exactly how he could spend some of it. Lady Amelia's birthday was coming up, and Elena was acting this way because she wanted him to buy an absurdly expensive present for her. The two started bickering, while Ghislaine stood there, confused. He didn't remember anything about having a fiancé. "What do you mean I have a fiancé?" Ghislaine asked, stunned. The girls giggled and told him there was no need to be shy. Both of them knew that Amelia from the kingdom of Rayfold was his fiancé. In that instant, Ghislaine's blood ran cold. The owner of that name was none other than an incredibly dangerous Black Widow, a noble among nobles, renowned for her kindness and for genuinely winning the support of the people in her kingdom despite her status. But in the near future, she would be the one to spark a rebellion, becoming known as the Wicked Witch of the North. Not only that, but she had joined forces with the Delphine family to bury the Perdium family for good. In other words, she was nothing more than a traitor. Ghislaine gave a faint smile and took the opportunity to ask when his father would return. Belinda replied that he was likely to be back in about a week. Well, a week should be enough. He left his room, announcing that he was going to pay a visit to the kingdom of Rayfold. Belinda questioned him. Amelia's birthday wasn't even close, and he answered that he was going to squeeze more money out of them. A woman knelt down, placing her shoes on the ground, and told a barefoot little girl to wear them. The girl couldn't have been happier. The lady declared that if anyone were to walk barefoot on her lands, it would be her, not the child. Amelia ordered her guards to bring food and shelter for those people, and shortly after, her soldiers fulfilled her command. As everyone thanked her, she made her way back to the castle. In her garden, one of her servants knelt to clean Amelia's feet. He was her personal knight, Bernaf. Her goal was to act differently from her father, who demanded absolute obedience from their people. But ordinary folks would always follow whoever provided them with shelter and good food. With that approach, she was steadily winning the hearts of the people, which would help her when the time came to claim the throne. She glanced at Bernaf and gave him a light kick in the face. "Tell me," she asked, "what happened in that duel against the best swordsman of the North?" Bernaf bowed his head, apologizing. He said he lost on purpose to avoid attracting unwanted attention. It still wasn't the time to show their true strength. His sword belonged only to her. That's the bare minimum. Amelia replied coldly, "I've invested in you exactly for that." She lifted his chin. "Being weak is forbidden for you." The princess then asked about the merchants. Bernaf assured her there was nothing to worry about. All the materials used to rebuild the Perdium watchtower, which had been destroyed by the ogres, had been sourced from the merchants of Action. This allowed those merchants to recover the full amount they paid Perdium annually. On top of that, they were also recruiting all the former soldiers from Perdium. It was good news, but they still needed to maintain the facade of being just a normal guild. They couldn't afford to reveal their true identity yet. Another servant entered the garden and reported that Lord Ghislaine Perdium had come for a visit. Immediately, Amelia's expression shifted. What could that spoiled brat possibly want? He said he wanted to talk about the Merchant Guild. Both Amelia's and Bernat's hearts froze at once. Stay calm. This might actually be something interesting, she thought. She left the garden and went to the reception hall. Now the two of them faced each other. Ghislaine greeted her out of politeness, but the princess was visibly uncomfortable with his presence. His arrival was anything but welcome, especially without any prior notice. It seemed the prince had skipped quite a few etiquette lessons. He said that since her birthday was coming up, he had come to her kingdom to give her a present in advance. He explained that he had found a flower being sold by the Merchant Guild. Its scent was delightful, and he planned to buy flowers from them from now on. At first, he pretended not to remember the name of the guild, but then casually said it, the Merchants of Action. It seemed her little scheme was on the verge of being exposed. Amelia stood up, pretending not to understand the prince's sweet talk. "I'm done here," she said. "Let's get to the gift." But Ghislaine suddenly called her name and ordered her to sit back down. At that moment, she realized something was different. Ghislaine's posture was completely opposite from the past. "Well, to be honest," he said, "let's get straight to the point. I need money. I'm here to ask for 10,000 gold." She stared, dumbfounded. "What? Why?" Ghislaine had shown up out of nowhere without any notice, asking for an absurd amount of money. "What kind of fiancé does that?" He responded flatly, "My father has nothing to do with this. And besides, let's not pretend. I know perfectly well you don't want to marry me." Her nerves tightened. Ghislaine played dirty, making it clear he knew Amelia's true intentions, in a kingdom where the fight for power was ruthless. She gained the people's support because before he could finish the sentence, she cut him off. "It's better if you don't finish that sentence. Mayum is a joke," Amelia warned sharply. Ghislaine smirked. "I was planning to keep this little secret to myself for now, but who knows if I'll hold my tongue if I leave here empty-handed." The witch snapped back. "That's not happening." She called for her knight. The doors swung open. Bernaf entered the room. "It's been a while, Lord Ghislaine," he greeted calmly. So this was the knight who had always stood by Amelia's side, a skilled man whose swordsmanship rivaled the best swordsman in the north. Ghislaine, ever the tactician, warned, "If I die here, it's very likely a war will break out." But Bernaf simply replied, "Oh, don't worry. What the world will hear is that a madman barged in, caused a scene, and died at the hands of a renowned knight." Without a second thought, Amelia gave Bernaf the command. The man drew his weapon, ready for battle. "If this is how you want to play," Ghislaine thought, "then I have no choice but to take this duel seriously." Bernaf draws his sword and looks at him confidently. But Ghislaine notices something different in his peripheral vision. One of the suits of armor moves from behind where it was standing, and a man emerges from it, coming directly toward him. The assassin strikes the sofa with all his strength, aiming at the victim sitting on it. But the prince is faster and turns the situation in his favor. He hits the assassin squarely and sends him flying out the window. Bernaf and Amelia watch in shock. Pretending to be that polite just to orchestrate a surprise attack was something new to him. What a horrible sense of hospitality the Rayfold family had. The princess's servant and Ghislaine exchanged some blows. It really seemed like they had forgotten how to properly treat their guests. Bernaf says that Ghislaine was the one who was disrespectful first by showing up out of nowhere. Because of that, there was no reason for him to be polite to someone like that. Holding Ghislaine's sword, he attempts a direct attack, but the prince dodges and counters with a kick. The two step back and stare at each other for a moment. As far as the servant knew, the prince was supposed to be someone with little skill, but it seems that in reality, he is anything but an amateur. Amelia questions why he is taking so long. It would be better if he brought her his head already if he really considered himself worthy of her sword. The knight then responds that he won't disappoint her and calls Ghislaine to the fight. The prince laughs at the servant's audacity. Both prepare themselves, the atmosphere growing increasingly hostile. The knight then makes his move. He is faster than the other expected, barely dodging in time. They then proceed into a deadly dance while Amelia watches. How could that man be called a loser when he was managing to keep up with Bernaf in a fight? The servant lands another precise strike, and the prince defends, trying to force him to release his sword, lean further forward. But once again, the knight manages to hold onto Ghislaine's sword and attack him. The same move again. There was the perfect decision for the prince to turn the tide. He makes his move, but Bernaf also says that repeating something like that won't work against him, and so the prince is thrown to the ground. Without giving his opponent a moment to breathe, the servant comes at him again. Somehow, Ghislaine manages to defend himself, and once again, the two step back to catch their breath. It seemed the man was managing to endure the fight through the use of mana. It looked like the saying about only truly knowing someone after fighting them was really true. The prince was very different from the rumors. His style seemed forged from the experience of countless battles. A barbaric method like that could work in a chaotic war, but not against Bernaf. His life would end there. As Ghislaine expected, this was proving difficult. The knight's technique was clean and well-trained. He could attack up close and defend in a highly coordinated way. He truly wasn't an opponent Ghislaine should be facing right now, but he didn't have much time to waste either. He conjures his mana thread, sending it to wrap around Bernaf and coil around his sword, and by pulling it, he strikes Bernaf directly in the head. Since he was leaning forward, Ghislaine takes the opening to hit him with his knee. The man is clearly dazed, and Amelia ends up shouting his name. Without giving him a chance to recover, the prince immediately goes in for another attack, but Bernaf manages to defend himself. He truly was a remarkable swordsman. He uses the force of the impact to shift direction and throw the prince backward. The two step apart once more, giving them time to reorganize both physically and mentally for the next strike. Bernaf asks the princess to leave the room. He can no longer guarantee her safety, because he is tired of holding back. That was exactly what Ghislaine wanted as well. It had been a long time since he had such an intriguing battle like this. Amelia then runs to the door, wondering who could have leaked information about the guild. The prince knew much more than he should. It seemed that the current rumors about him, his battles, saving his sister, and defeating Cain Loges were actually true. At first, she thought that spoiled brat had just gotten lucky or that people were exaggerating, but this time she was wrong. She wondered what the royal guards she had hired were doing since she hadn't seen any of them in the hallway so far. But as she turned the corner, she came face to face with her guards lying on the ground and a figure standing among them. That figure slowly turned around and revealed the face of Belinda. Apparently, she wasn't just any maid after all. Amelia is startled to see the maid from the Perdium family. The other woman tells her to stay quiet, and in the blink of an eye, she's already behind the lady with a dagger in hand. The princess is shocked by Belinda's speed. Nimbly, the young woman plucks the spider off Amelia's chin and says that it wasn't proper for a lady like her to walk around with a creature like that. After all, during the conversation about the two's engagement, the maid had overheard a certain discussion between Count Perdium and Count Leopold. It seemed that after being tormented with spiders by her brothers, the lady decided to raise her own spiders to torment them back. Walking around with that spider on her face could be an attempt to overcome the trauma, or maybe just a way to draw attention. The maid apologizes but says that it really didn't suit a princess. She then throws the spider to the floor and steps on it immediately. Now Amelia just needed to follow her instructions and everything would be fine. Meanwhile, the two men are still staring each other down in the sitting room. The prince starts to feel that the air was heavier than normal. The amount of mana waves being released by Bernaf was incredible. The knight says that calling someone an interesting opponent was something only a half-baked mercenary would say. How could Ghislaine possibly think of himself as a noble capable of standing on equal footing with Lady Rayfold? Well, like it or not, Ghislaine was indeed a noble, and Bernaf was being disrespectful since, after all, he was nothing more than a knight. The atmosphere becomes even more hostile, and the two clash. Bernaf declares that his opponent is an insult to nobility. His attacks become even faster. The prince notices the difference and does everything he can to defend himself. Since his training wasn't yet complete, he starts having some difficulty keeping up with the knight, dodging his attacks only narrowly. It was clear now. Bernaf was no longer holding back. Ghislaine asks if he couldn't slow down just a bit and dodges another strike. finally getting an opening to respond. His opponent tries to read his movements, but this time the prince was doing something different. Even so, Bernaf manages to turn his sword in time, forcing Ghislaine to step back slightly. Now he realized he could truly lose his life if he made even a single mistake. Bernaf sees that he's destabilized and says that was the young man's last attack. The prince is hit, but the knight is shocked to realize he hadn't achieved his goal. Somehow, at the last second, Ghislaine had turned his shoulder just enough to avoid a fatal injury. The fight resumes between the two. No one could lower their guard for even a second. Their swords swing from side to side, and in an opening, Bernaf manages to land a kick. The difference between someone like Bernaf and someone who fought purely for the sake of fighting made this battle slightly less favorable for Ghislaine. Even after being pushed back, he had to admit the knight was right. He really was having fun. The knight kept his strikes at an excellent speed and very close to his opponent, which allowed him to block the prince's physical attacks. There was no way to defeat someone who could make it feel like his sword was always present at any moment from any direction. At least not with the amount of mana Ghislaine had right now. That was the only thing keeping the fight balanced. But even so, unfortunately, he had to defeat this man. Because there was one thing the knight didn't know, and that was Ghislaine's mana technique. The young man then activates his third mana core, increasing his speed and going straight for a lethal strike. Bernaf still manages to defend himself, but on the third clash between their swords, the knight's sword flies far away. He stares at the young man, shocked at what had just happened. How had he managed to boost his mana power like that in the middle of the fight? A voice suddenly screams from afar, interrupting the battle and making the prince freeze mid-movement. Amelia and Belinda had arrived in the room and were staring at the scene of Ghislaine's victory over Bernaf. The princess says he could take the amount of gold he asked for. She just wanted him to leave quickly. Of course, the young men complain. She could have made that decision much earlier. It would have saved everyone all this trouble. Bernaf was still frozen in place. The battle was finally decided, but unfortunately, he had bad news for Amelia. Now he was going to want 20,000 in gold. Chaos had broken out in the castle, and Amelia couldn't be more irritated. Even a cat was hiding under the couch. She threw a flower vase to the floor with all her strength to vent some of the rage she was feeling. Bernardo apologized for losing the battle. His opponent had been stronger than he expected. Amelia had to admit that the prince had changed. Should we report this to Duke Delphin? Bernardo asked. But the princess slapped him across the face. It was better for him to watch what he was saying. If Delphine found out about what had happened, he would get rid of both of them. The reason she had allied herself with the Duke without her father knowing was because he had promised to help her in the rebellion she was planning. And if Perdium knew about the secret regarding the guild, soon they could find out about her pact with Delphine as well. That boy needed to disappear quickly, so she asked about the prince's physical condition. Bernardo replied that he had some minor scratches and a deep cut on his shoulder. Since he had used mana against him, he was probably recovering by now. However, if she couldn't pull this off without raising suspicion, there was no way to use her father's military power. But that was exactly the reason they had been training those soldiers. Maybe it was time to unleash the power of the wild wolves. They were an elite group of warriors made up of orphans without status or name. A royal pack of traffickers. Right at the point where the prince's carriage would likely pass, she wanted the best and most talented wolves ready for the ambush. It was the border between the kingdom of Leipold and Perdium, an excellent spot to take someone out since it wasn't very frequented. Bernardo would be in charge of contacting the mercenaries. Humiliated by the doormen, Princess Amelia would make sure Ghislaine paid with his own life. The prince's carriage raced out of the castle, and inside he was tending to his wounds. Belinda and Fergus were clearly worried about the young master, but he insisted that he was fine. The wound wasn't that deep, and considering he had used his third mana core, he wasn't in that bad of a shape. The amount of gold he had gotten from Amelia was enough to rebuild his territory, and it saved him a few years' worth of effort. It would have been great if he had managed to get rid of Amelia and her mutt, but he couldn't put his kingdom at risk. That could lead to war. He already had enough trouble dealing with the northern barbarians, so it was better to retreat for now. Surely Amelia would start calculating her next steps more carefully, especially knowing that Ghislaine was aware of the merchant guild. He would make sure to siphon money from that kingdom as much as he could this time. Belinda stared at him. It seemed everything had gone exactly as the prince had told her. He had ordered her to knock out the guards if she heard any sounds of battle from the room and to take Amelia's maid hostage. He agreed with the maid's statement, but midway through his sentence, he began to feel pain from having used too much mana. He winced slightly but noticed that the rebound effect wasn't as bad as the last time he had used that technique. He needed to hurry and increase his mana level. But while lost in thought, Belinda grabbed his hand and inspected it. She said his mana flow was completely out of order and started performing some kind of acupuncture on his palm. Gradually, the prince began feeling better, and then she finished with a strike to his head. That made him cough up whatever was disrupting his mana flow. Now he felt much better than before. He knew Belinda wasn't just any maid. After all, she had been hired by his mother, the queen. But to be this skilled with mana, who was this woman really? Why would someone this powerful be in such a small country? Well, it wasn't entirely a bad thing to have someone strong by his side. After all, this was just the beginning. The carriage continued at full speed or the other kingdom. Belinda said she trusted her master and would help him however she could, but she wanted to know why they had gone to Amelia to ask for so much money. He replied that he needed money, and the only person he knew who had that amount was Amelia. The two servants were left speechless by that answer. He had ended the engagement and caused all that chaos just to get money. What would Count Leopold think? But they didn't need to worry about that. Amelia wouldn't be able to report what had happened to her father. Well, since that was the case, he could at least tell them what he planned to do with all that money. Kislane fell silent for a moment, and then, to Belinda's surprise, he said he intended to take possession of the monster forest. Fergus immediately began saying the idea was madness. After all, their ancestors had tried and failed. But the prince had asked him for something before they entered the castle, and it was related to this plan. The old knight swallowed hard and said that he had found the person, but he wasn't sure about the man's character. As long as he was alive, there was still a chance. They needed to go meet him right away. Belinda disapproved of the idea. After all, her master was already injured, but he argued that Amelia wouldn't let them escape that easily anyway. She tried to insist that she was a good warrior and could protect him, but he now needed a different kind of warrior, someone capable of standing on the front lines. And that was exactly who they were going to meet now. They finally arrived at a wooden house and knocked on the door. The place seemed a bit abandoned. Was the address correct? They wondered. But someone began opening the door, and an old man stepped out from inside. He asked who they were and what they wanted there. Because of his appearance, the maid asked whether he was really the guy they were looking for. He looked more like a beggar than anything else. But he was indeed the man Kislane was searching for. The old man realized the young man was a noble and told him to just leave and stop bothering him. But then the prince used the old man's former name. He had once been the captain of a very famous mercenary group. His name was Gillian. The old man stared in disbelief at what the young man had just said, but then the prince extended his hand and said it was an honor to meet him. So that was the former leader of the Ratatos Guild. The mercenary guild known for having warriors capable of fighting with any type of weapon. Even though it had disbanded in the past, its name had become legendary among warriors, and the captain of that group was named Gillian. Kislane had come all the way there because he wanted to meet him personally. An axe flew toward him, passing dangerously close to his head. That instantly put all the servants on high alert. It seems someone still remembered who they were dealing with. Everyone took a defensive stance protecting the prince. The old man asked what exactly they wanted. Belinda told them to fall back, but the prince had a different idea. Then he mentioned the eternal punishment and said he knew the cure for the old man's daughter's illness. Had he finally gotten Gillian's attention now? It seemed the girl suffered from high fevers, persistent coughing, and skin lesions that looked like flower buds spreading across her body. The disease was called eternal punishment precisely because it caused incurable pain in those afflicted. The old man gave in and let them all inside, just as his daughter was having one of her episodes caused by the illness. He called out to Rachel as he held her trembling in his arms. Observing the girl's condition, Kislane saw that it wasn't too late to reverse the illness. In his previous life, he had also tried to recruit Gillian, but because of the pain of losing his daughter, the old man hadn't been able to endure. Judging by the state of the house, he must have tried to sell everything in an attempt to cure his daughter, and only weapons remained. The girl begged for the pain to end quickly. There was no more time to waste. They needed to start the treatment immediately. But as Kislane was preparing, Belinda stopped him, asking him to step aside. She asked what exactly he intended to do since even doctors and priests hadn't been able to find a cure for that disease. But he replied that he could save her. Belinda just needed to keep trusting him. The prince then handed her a paper with some ingredients written on it and said he needed every herb listed there. The maid looked at the paper in disbelief. For a mercenary with no home to return to, knowledge was equivalent to survival. Even though that disease was still incurable in the present, in the future the cure already existed. It had been the subject of much discussion across many countries, especially because the cure was surprisingly simple to make. Thanks to that, he still remembered the recipe clearly. The problem was that it required one incredibly expensive ingredient, the flower known as Fairy's Blessing. All he had to do was mash that flower together with the medicinal herbs and place them in a jar before pouring a bit of water over it, just enough to mix it well before adding the rest of the ingredients. And with that, the medicine was ready. He handed the small vial to Gillian and told him to give it to his daughter. With hope in his eyes, the father gave the medicine to his child. Her breathing began to calm, and little by little the rashes started to fade. It was as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Gillian asked Rachel if she truly felt better. The medicine was more powerful than he had expected. The man asked how the prince even knew about it. After all, not even divine power could cure his daughter. Well, not even the priest's blessings were capable of curing everything. They only helped the body recover faster and prevented illness. It was very different from creating a medicine that attacked the root of the disease itself. So, does this mean my daughter can really be saved? Gillian asked. The prince replied, in about 1 or 2 months. She should be completely fine. At that moment, the man knelt before him and asked what he could do to repay him. The only thing he had left was his own body. If you want me to become your dog, I'll bark. If you want me as your slave, I'll accept gladly, he said. But neither a slave nor a dog was what Kislane wanted. What he truly desired had to do with Gillian's former self as the guild master. Looking into the boy's eyes, the old man could see how ambitious they were. Then the old man grabbed his own hair and with a swift swing of his axe cut it, letting the braid fall to the ground. Everyone stared at him as if he were someone from another world. The entire aura of the place shifted completely. A new man now stood before them. He walked to a corner of the house and asked, "Is anyone else coming, or is it just us?" The prince replied, "It's just us." Gillian then asked if there was anyone who held a grudge against the young man. Well, that was as clear as the sun in the sky. In that case, there was only one right answer. The old warrior launched a harpoon, breaking through the wall of his own house until it struck a tree outside. When he pulled it back, the body of a man was impaled on the spear. Grabbing the man by the neck, he asked who had sent him. The man had no idea how to respond, but the old man kept pressing him. Ghislaine interrupted for a moment, saying that he had a good guess about who might have sent him. The prince tried to draw his sword, but Gillian stopped him. "I'll make sure to finish this job for you," the old man said. A scream echoed before silence returned. Now the old man knelt before the prince, but something about him still unsettled Belinda. He hadn't hesitated even for a second to take that man's life. As she watched the man kneel, she wondered why her young master had chosen someone so dangerous. But from now on, that man's life belonged entirely to Ghislaine, and Ghislaine said it was a pleasure to have that old warrior by his side. Night had finally fallen, and the group of wild wolves was gathered. News had arrived that they had lost one of their own, and a slight murmur spread among them. One of them demanded silence and told everyone to lower their voices. His name was Vigo. Immediately, the others fell silent and apologized to the boss. Based on the information they had received from the Knight Bernardo, the prince shouldn't have the strength to fight against them. But what they didn't expect was that Gillian would be by his side. Hearing this, the leader grabbed his subordinate by the neck and asked if what he was saying was really true. The man replied that he had seen it with his own eyes. Their former leader was back in the game. Now with one more companion, the carriage continued its journey toward the kingdom of Perdium. Because of the new weapons, the carriage was extremely cramped. They had taken every weapon from Gillian's house, even had to buy a second carriage just to carry everything. Even so, the ride was still quite uncomfortable, with priority given to Rachel's comfort. For that reason, Ricardo and Fergus were riding in the carriage behind. All of this would be useful in the near future. For now, the most important thing was to cross that valley without further problems. Ghislaine was almost certain that the spy had been sent by Lady Amelia, so perhaps things were about to get a bit complicated. The masked man had warned signaled that he was part of the Wild Wolves Mercenaries, a powerful guild in Leipold. Ghislaine asked what kind of guild that was. Belinda explained that they specialized in all sorts of underworld dealings. They did any kind of dirty work. The prince grew curious about how she knew so much about them. She tried to brush it off, saying she'd lived a bit before going to work at the castle. Either way, they were persistent, so they needed to be careful. But Ghislaine was confident that everything would be fine now that they had a new warrior by their side. The carriage continued deeper into the forest when suddenly a crack began forming in the ground, encircling the carriage. Two assassins appeared, heading straight for the driver. But an ambush like that wasn't nearly enough to catch Gillian off guard. He pulled his spear and an axe from his back, blocking the attack. His strength was clearly superior. He managed to knock both daggers aside and mobilize the two enemies with ease. The way he fought made it seem like disarming them was as easy as taking candy from a child. And just like that, the two enemies were left behind. But there were others behind the ambush. A massive tree trunk came crashing down toward them. If they didn't defend themselves, they would be completely crushed. The old man stopped the horses just in time, so the trunk fell mere inches from the carriage without hitting them. As the prince had expected, they were now surrounded by the wild wolves. One of them called Gillian by name and by his old title. It seems someone else remembered him from his past. The man clearly held resentment toward Gillian for disbanding the mercenary group for the sake of his daughter's life. Without recognizing the person behind the mask, the warrior said he had no idea what the man was talking about. The man began blaming Gillian for the life he now lived. Had Gillian truly changed so much that he no longer remembered a former comrade? Still, the warrior remained silent. Well, if he wouldn't recognize him through words, then he would make him recognize him through strength. He ordered his gang to attack their former master. Ghislaine asked if the old man needed any help, but Gillian declined, saying the man's hatred was directed at him, not the prince. Besides, he could handle that number of enemies without any problem. With that, he cut down half a dozen of them with a single movement. More came charging at him, but he knew exactly how to handle it. He had fought many battles in his life. Whether good or bad, they had all served to bring him to this level of strength. Despite his age, his body had not forgotten the days of being a mercenary. The leader then switched tactics, ordering his men to split up and attack Gillian from both sides. The old man mounted one of the horses, confusing the enemies. Grabbing a double-headed spear, he began spinning it, making anyone who dared approach regret that decision immediately. Unable to get close, they started thinking about attacking the horse. But Gillian's weapon was no ordinary one. Could be used in multiple ways at close, mid, and long range. In brutal fashion, the wild wolves were being slaughtered. One of them tried to attack him from above, but Gillian raised a shield for defense. The attacker was his former disciple, clearly bloodthirsty. The man struck the horse Gillian was riding. Forced to abandon his mount, Gillian faced yet another attack. but parried it with masterful skill. Striking the enemy with the shield, he declared, "I am no longer the leader of the Ratatosk mercenaries." Thrown backward, the man still tried to stand. He couldn't accept that his former leader had abandoned the title, but now that man had left his past behind and served no one but Master Ghislaine. Hearing that, the Wild Wolves' leader flew into a rage and charged forward. The sound of their weapons clashing could be heard from far away. The battle was heating up between the two. The fact that Ratatosk had fallen apart after Gillian's departure seemed to have completely dismantled VO's life. This forced him to take jobs in the underworld. Still, the old man showed no mercy, attacking relentlessly. The masked man landed a kick on the shield, breaking it. Vigo had been ready to dedicate his life to that guild, but the old man had given everything up just to become some noble's lapdog. That was pathetically unacceptable. He threw another flurry of kunai, but the warrior dodged them. Taking advantage of the old man's movement, Vigo lunged for a frontal attack, but Gillian dodged it. Even while still in midair, the masked man managed to evade the following blow. Gillian might still be strong, but not as strong as he once was. While the old man spent his time taking care of his daughter, Viego had accumulated far more combat experience. Thinking the old man was no longer a problem, he went to where the kunai had landed and kicked them toward his opponent. Even though they came from his blind spot, the warrior defended himself without taking serious damage. Vigo was exploiting every blind spot of his opponent and had finally found the perfect opening. He launched his attack, but something unexpected happened. Gillian caught his dagger with his bare hands. It seemed that Vigo's desire for revenge wasn't as strong as he thought, and the few seconds he spent stunned by his opponent's mana were enough for him to be hit squarely and thrown far away. He crashed into a tree and fell to the ground. Gillian couldn't understand why Viego hadn't attacked him earlier if he truly wanted revenge. There had been so many opportunities, yet he chose that day. Vigo then revealed that he had already scouted Gillian's house before, but the man he found there wasn't the one he used to know. It was just an old man who didn't even deserve to taste his blade. What he was really looking for was Gillian, the leader of the Rathatos Guild, one of the most renowned in the world, not some worthless dying old man. The warrior threw his sword to the ground and ordered Viego to get up. Now he understood and would face him as he wished. Even though he had a master, he would fight his comrade face to face as the leader he once was, no longer as a mere bodyguard. Viego finally felt relieved to hear that and got fired up to face the man in front of him. That was exactly what he wanted. The battle restarted with ferocity. Neither of them backed down. They just kept charging at each other. Vigo was struck in the ribs, but despite the pain, he kept attacking. He wouldn't give up that easily. As he raised his axe, Gillian said he would make sure to remember him, because he knew he was the leader of the Ratatosk's 5th squad. Vigo Villanos was his name. The man smiled and accepted his fate. Gillian picked up the dagger from the ground, adding one more weapon to his arsenal. Then he heard a voice from the carriage congratulating him. It seemed that the money they would get from those people would make for a nice profit. The warrior apologized for the delay, but Ghislaine said it was fine. He had to admit Gillian was far more exceptional than he had expected. The stories he had heard about him during his time as a mercenary were what helped him take his position as their king. Thank God he managed to recruit a man like that into his band. He asked if, during the fight, the old man remembered who he was fighting. Gillian replied that yes, it had been an old companion of his. At that moment, the prince reflected on what his former companions might be doing during that period he found himself in. They were probably living their lives normally after all. He had only met them in the future. Maybe it would be good to search for them soon to recruit them again. 2 days passed, and now they were finally arriving at the kingdom of Perdium. Everyone watched the distant cities while chatting casually. He had to admit it was indeed a beautiful country to return to. When he fled in his past life, he thought he would be able to come back whenever he wanted. Gillian watched him thoughtfully. Then the prince asked what his first impression of the kingdom was. He said the old man could be honest. No need for politeness. After all, he knew the houses were old and unrepaired, and that open field wasn't being used since most of the strong men had become soldiers. While Gillian knew that kingdom had always been at war with the barbarians, but he hadn't realized things were in such poor condition. Belinda hadn't expected the old man to know that much about their territory. Then the prince said he wanted to solve all those problems, and that was why he needed everyone's help. The battle would be long until he could protect everything and eliminate Duke Delphine and his allies. He was determined to make his territory prosper, no matter how difficult it would be. As they climbed the city's slope, they suddenly spotted someone unexpected. It seemed his father had returned to the city. Meanwhile, in Perdium's castle, an assembly had started to decide what steps to take regarding the kingdom's situation. It seemed that allied countries like Leipold had reduced financial aid to increase their own resources. They still needed to finish construction on the forest outpost, and on top of that, they needed more soldiers stationed in the country. Reducing troops would be very dangerous. Observing the whole discussion, Ghislaine realized they hadn't changed a bit. The captain of the knights, Randolph, the financial chief, Albert, and the castle administrator, Homer, were exactly as he remembered. It may have been only a few months in that reality, but for the mercenary soul of Ghislaine now inhabiting that body, it felt like years. After listening to all that pointless chatter, he finally decided to speak, addressing his father, Count Zivalter Perdium, directly. When he was younger, He hated his father's rigid and formal way of acting. But now he understood the fatigue and countless battles weighed heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't easy carrying the burden of being the king of a country. So Walter took the moment to ask where his son had gone. The prince replied that he had paid a short visit to the kingdom of Leipold, trying to show some concern for his son, perhaps even for the neighboring country. He asked if the boy hadn't gotten himself into trouble. Lying, Ghislaine replied that he hadn't. Albert then asked him about the rumors circulating that he had come into some money after a duel with Bernardo, and begged that he hadn't gone there just to lose his own money. He replied that he had some matters to discuss with Amelia, and had no intention of gambling his money away. Knowing how the young man tended to behave, Homer started a mild scolding, but Ghislaine told him there was nothing to worry about. Obviously, the administrator was irritated at being interrupted like that. As yet another argument was about to start, a king interrupted the two. He had heard some rumors about his son while he was away, and wanted to know if it was true about the fight against Jamal and Philippe regarding their betrayal of Helena. The young man recalled the faces of those two scoundrels, but soon Randolph spoke up, saying the prince couldn't have handled both of them. Likely they fought each other and Ghislaine delivered the final blow. Not wanting to cause problems with the captain, he went with it and said people had exaggerated the story. Randolph sighed in relief hearing that, but something unexpected happened. For the first time in his life, Ghislaine was praised by his father. It didn't matter how he had done it. What mattered was that Helena's safety was guaranteed. He stayed silent for a few moments, still processing what had just happened. But soon after, he said he wanted to ask the king for a favor. As soon as he said that, the older men started thinking he wanted his allowance back, but that wouldn't happen so easily. The captain began listing all the things he had done in search of money, which had caused losses to the kingdom. The young man had to admit he had indeed caused a lot of trouble. But that wasn't what he wanted to talk about. What he wanted was the king's permission for something. He wanted to take responsibility for reclaiming the monster forest, and the king's answer was a resounding no. With the most shameless face in the world, he said that after his request, everyone started cursing him and kicked him out of the room. Of course they would, Belinda thought. Who in their right mind would walk into a hornet's nest just to claim it as their own? It seemed Jillian was also aware of the plan. That forest was known as the Forest of Death. No one who had entered it ever came out, and no living soul knew what was inside. The notoriety of the monsters in that forest was also known in other regions. It looked like his new partner was well informed about things. He knew that challenging that forest would be almost a death sentence, but he was still willing to try. Belinda scolded the two since the prince hadn't gotten permission, but he replied that he had only asked out of politeness. It was something that needed to be done, whether they liked it or not. My God, why is he being so stubborn? What the hell is in that forest? She complained, but the only answer she got was that she would find out later. He couldn't allow rumors to spread or for anyone to learn what he knew. If they managed to conquer the forest, the kingdom would become one of the richest. Not far from the forest's monster entrance, there was a massive vein of precious stones. They were incredibly rare and sought after by sorcerers, since they contained magical powers. These stones were used in various items from alchemy to research. In other words, they were extremely valuable for anyone studying magic. In his past life, it was Duke Delphine who had made that discovery. But in this life, only Ghislaine knew about it. Belinda was clearly uncomfortable with the prince's suspicious behavior, but she still knew he had his reasons, and the warrior was also willing to follow his orders. With that said, he asked his maid to start recruiting some mercenaries from neighboring territories for the expedition. But she couldn't believe they were going to spend that precious money on something with no guarantees yet. Gillian questioned the young master's choices. After all, mercenaries were hard to control and would likely try to betray him. She knew that better than anyone. That was why the two of them would recruit together, starting with a small mercenary guild from the north, one that the old man probably knew very well. He then asked if the prince was talking about the rabid dogs. They had some skill, but wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood against them, even their own employees. Also known as the Kelveros mercenaries, they were exactly who Ghislaine wanted to hire. It was time to put collars on some stray dogs. They went to where the Kelveros camp was located. Someone had already spotted them from afar and assumed the two were lost. Judging by the clothing, one of them was definitely a noble. They were going to make good money this time. But before the man could finish speaking, a massive hand lunged toward him. Hearing the scream, everyone in the guild stopped to watch. Gillian was holding one of their members by the head. The man asked what the hell that guy was trying to do. Without a hint of shame, the warriors simply tossed him far away. They had drawn the attention they wanted, exactly as planned. A man appeared, saying that even though one of them was a noble, a guy like him shouldn't act that way. There was no way they'd leave without leaving at least a piece of themselves behind. But before the fight could start, Ghislaine rode forward on his horse. He then told the man to shut up and just say where the guild leader was. The man smiled at the young man's audacity. He said the boy clearly had no idea what he was getting himself into, and since he had started this, it was only fair that he take responsibility. He hurled the iron ball toward Ghislaine, but it was perfectly deflected even before it could hit the prince. Everyone was shocked by what had just happened. The old man had managed to wedge his sword between the weapon's chains. The prince knew that these people probably wouldn't be very open to diplomatic conversation, so there was only one option left. Without thinking twice, he commanded Gillian to just be careful not to kill their opponents, They were going to need them. With that said, the old man grabbed the chain and pulled with all of his strength, causing the guy from earlier to be flung through the air. At the same time, he lifted the chain ball and swung it in the same direction, hitting him squarely. More soldiers began approaching, which was great since the old man was practically playing bowling at this point. He glared at the rest of the opponents just to make sure they all felt fear. The prince dismounted his horse and asked how much longer they were going to have to wait. It would be better if the leader came out soon. He wanted to speak directly with him. Suddenly, someone appeared, rumbling that he had been enjoying a very nice nap. Instantly, all the soldiers snapped into formation. The man introduced himself as Kaur, the leader of that mercenary guild. So, what do you guys want from me? Straight to the point, Ghislaine said he wanted to hire their guild for a job. But the leader questioned why they had done that to his men if they wanted to hire them. Is it because you're nobles that you're not versed in etiquette? He asked. Ghislaine replied that this was just his way of saying hello. He figured it would be the most effective way to get his attention. Well, you definitely managed that. So who exactly wants to hire us? The prince explained that he needed his men to conquer the monster forest. A wave of murmuring spread among the soldiers, but Kaur's attention was caught. Why would a kid want to play around in a place as dangerous as that? Ghislaine then introduced himself fully. I am Ghislaine Perdium, son of Count Zavalter Perdium. A moment of silence followed, before an explosion of laughter erupted. Oh, so you're the spoiled prince of the king. Now it makes sense why you acted like that earlier. Still laughing, Kaur said that place wasn't meant for little kids. He'd heard enough. He gave the command to his men. The old man raised his axe, but the prince played a card no one expected. He asked, "What's wrong, Kaur? Are you scared? I heard your mercenary guild was really strong. But maybe those were just exaggerated rumors after all." In an instant, the leader stomped his foot hard onto the table. It would be better if the little prince didn't show his claws too much. After all, they were mercenaries. They wouldn't take a job without being paid. But Ghislaine replied, "Cowards always find an excuse." It seemed the prince knew exactly how to toy with the mercenary's pride. The leader took a deep breath and said he was tired of the kids' games. "I'll let you leave. Just leave a little money behind to treat my man." But Ghislaine was persistent. To try and recruit him, he issued a challenge. "I challenge you to a battle of Moriana." Everyone there was stunned when they heard that. Kaur asked if he really knew what that meant, and the prince answered, "Yes. This is how mercenaries settle things." In that kind of duel, both fighters couldn't use mana. They were only allowed a dagger. On top of that, their free hands had to be tied together. Stepping outside the circle also meant immediate defeat. It was, in short, a particularly brutal and restrictive form of combat. Most of the time, it ended with neither of the duelists surviving. And for this fight specifically, Ghislaine's proposal was clear. Whoever lost would become the winner's dog. Now all that was left was for Kaur to accept. Gillian stared in shock. How could a noble like that even know something so specific? Refusing a challenge like that was the same as admitting weakness. Kaur then burst into laughter. "Looks like this noble wants to win us over by playing our game. I can't refuse that." The two tied their hands together and prepared for the fight. The entire camp was in a frenzy. It wasn't every day they got to witness a fight like this. Kaur chuckled and said, "Looks like the little prince heard some stories about this kind of duel, and now he wants to try it himself. But there's no backing out now." After pulling him slightly just to intimidate him, Kaur said, "I've done this about 5 times already." His confident grin was unmistakable. But the prince pulled him in closer and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. 5 times? That's nothing. I've done this more than 100. Someone signals the start, and the two begin to clash. Both were quick-thinking and agile. They dodged each other's blows. It was clear that his opponent was someone experienced. The synchronicity between their attacks and defenses was almost unnatural. Kaur pulled Ghislaine, trying to throw him off balance, but the prince knew that move well. Even with his back turned to his opponent, he managed to defend and evade. He tried to change the direction of his movements, but Kaur came in with a calculated kick. The two collided, blocking each other's legs. But Ghislaine quickly realized that maybe blocking like that hadn't been the best idea. Kaur was physically stronger than him. Kaur praised him, admitting he was surprised that the prince had fought this way before, since duels like that were rare. "If you really want to brag," Kaur said, "you better be able to keep up and be convincing." The fight continued between the two, while the men around them cheered for their boss. But a single glare from Gillian was enough to make the crowd reconsider their excitement. He noticed the prince was at a disadvantage. The circle was already too small for anyone to even lie down inside it, and without being able to use mana, they were fully reliant on physical strength. The young man had to not only deal with the physical difference between the two, but also with his own restricted movements. He was barely managing to block and dodge Kaur's attacks. Meanwhile, the redhead was exploiting every single one of those weaknesses, fully controlling the pace of the fight. If his young master were to enter real danger, Gillian would have to step in. Kaur grabbed him by the arm, flinging him to the other side while going for a strike. But somehow, the prince dodged and landed safely on the other side. As expected, his leg was indeed injured from blocking that earlier attack. Not being able to use mana to protect himself was starting to become a real problem. Kaur noticed Ghislaine's concern and relished it. That prince was truly pathetic. But for a noble, he actually seemed pretty grounded, Kaur thought. Thanks to his combat knowledge, he could easily read the other's movements. He dodged and blocked the deadliest blows, using his body to absorb the less dangerous ones. But because of the rules of the duel in the name of Moriana, The pain would gradually accumulate since mana couldn't be used for recovery. The prince was starting to feel the effects of the fight in one of his legs. He could try to fight as much as he wanted. Watching prey struggle was more entertaining anyway. Kor shifted his grip on the dagger, going in for a strike, but it was blocked. Another flurry of blows was exchanged between them. Kor found an opening to go for a knee strike again. If it landed, it would be a knockout for the prince. But the young man reacted quickly, blocking once more. The problem was, he had used the same injured leg again, and the pain shot up, worse than before. And that was exactly what Kor wanted. The moment Ghislaine's attention flickered to the pain was the perfect opening. The tension spiked. Gillian prepared himself to jump in, but Ghislaine had other plans. He threw himself sideways, dodging the dagger's path entirely. Kor was caught completely off guard. He hadn't expected the prince to be capable of that. Ghislaine completed his spin using the weight of his body, and the first real strike of the duel was his. A gash opened on Kor's side. Everyone was stunned by the sudden turn of events. The redhead had tried to attack Ghislaine again, but the prince not only dodged, he landed another clean hit. His soldiers started cheering louder for their boss now, but their cheers were edged with concern. Earlier, that noble had been struggling to deal with him, but now he was landing hits. "Boss, take back control of the fight," they shouted. Kor tried to close the distance again, but the blonde not only dodged, he hit him square in the face. Taking full advantage of the opening, he continued attacking, without mercy. Twisting the dagger, he slashed Kor's arm. Rage was now consuming the redhead. What the hell kind of game was that prince playing? Just moments ago, he was struggling to even dodge. From the audience, Gillian was beginning to understand the young master's strategy. If you use too much strength to punch or make big movements, your body tenses up. You lose flexibility. At no point did Ghislaine try to match Kor's brute strength. Instead, he kept moving, maintaining his flow. Gillian had never imagined the boy would be able to handle the physical strength gap between him and Kor like that. The young guild leader was clearly being caught off guard. Ghislaine said he admired Kor's tenacity. At that point, some men in the crowd started activating mana when they saw their boss losing. But Kor barked at them. "I'm not that kind of guy. I became the leader of this guild through this kind of fight. If I cheated now, I wouldn't even deserve to call myself a mercenary." His opponent couldn't help but find that admirable. Kor then admitted it. He was indeed at a disadvantage against the prince, but there were other ways to win. He pivoted to attempt to grapple. Another rule in the Duel of Moriana was that you lost if you were forced out of the circle. Sure, the prince was a decent fighter, but if Kor threw him outside the ring, Kor would win. Confident in that plan, the redhead was already celebrating victory in his head. But yeah, our protagonist doesn't lose that easily. Ghislaine used the momentum of his own body, spun in the air, and landed on Kor's stomach. From there, he pushed off, flipping himself behind his opponent, and tackled him to the ground. In less than half a second, Kor's face was sliding outside the ring. He had been forced out of the circle, which meant Ghislaine had won. The redhead kicked and squirmed a bit, but the prince told him, "You better fix that attitude, because starting now, I'm your master." He dragged Kor back into the ring. The redhead grumbled, "What the hell are you doing? The fight's over." But the prince grinned and said, "You haven't stepped back inside the ring yet. It's time for a little obedience training." Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.